Good morning, everybody, except it's afternoon. I've just listened to Roy Gain giving an interview with Peter Dixon. I think he's not quite finished, but I need to get started. I'm doing a few videos on Glacier View because I'm being interviewed next week. I've got so much stuff. I've done a number of PowerPoint outlines that I thought I'd do some of it on video. In this particular interview, now I have done about 20 hours of interviews before, and I may repeat some things, but I did those in 2017, and at the time I mainly wrote transcripts for them before I did them. I'm much better being organised than, when I do the interview I'll probably go off-piste, as I put it, skiing language, where you're going down the mountain, you go off the side. I've got a mind that goes everywhere, so it's better for me to organise myself as I did with my podcasts. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Glacier View. I was there with Des, and I have written about it. I wrote some notes. I wrote letters which are either in Avondale or they will eventually go there in the archives. I wrote a chapter in Adventist Crisis of Spiritual Identity on Glacier View. That was about a year or two after Glacier View, so it was fairly fresh. I did the podcast, and I may have written other bits, but I did a podcast when it was actually recorded, and it might have been a video at the time, but I have it in podcast form in 1987 at the Avondale Centennial, and I believe that was held at Charlestown in Sydney in the afternoon meeting. Des did a talk. His talk was about his view for Adventism, and I did 2 podcasts on Glacier View, and hopefully these are going to go up on Des's website when that goes up, the new website. Today's date is the 5th of August 2020, and that website is imminent, but it's just a massive job. It hasn't quite got up there yet, but those podcasts are on there. They will be with the collection of Des's stuff. Most of that has already gone. I still have 8 boxes of documents to scan. I've just moved, about 5 months ago. I don't seem to be able to get to the scanning, but hopefully after these interviews are done, I'll get time to do that and get it finished. But the 20 hours of Glacier View I did in 2017, and I wrote transcripts, as I said. Des read them. We had a lot of interaction back there. He told me stuff I didn't know. He also did a few Glacier View videos. And then, when I went to Armidale, and I did a graduate certificate in local family and applied history, and I liked it so much that I did a master of history, which I finished, I think, about 2010. And I did an assignment on Des and his views on prophecy and how he developed them and how they led to Glacier View. So there's stuff about Glacier View in there. And I wrote something recently called, that I'm still working on. Gil Valentine corrected it, and I haven't had time to get back to it, called Working Class Girl, that's me, meets Halley's Comet, which was Des. So I'm working on that. And then, because I'm getting ready for this interview, I've done 4 or 5 PowerPoint outlines, which are a wonderful way to organise a talk, because you have the heading and 3 points, and you can move your slides around and you end up with a pretty good speaking outline. So that's what I'm starting today. Now, Today, I'm going to talk about the why of Glacier View. Not the WHY, but the why. And it's actually about the how of Glacier View, and that's confusing, but it's a short form of telling you what the forces were that led us to Glacier View, and that's the left strut is sort of my history, how I sort of met Des and got involved briefly, just the high points, and the Concerned Brethren, how that developed. Of course, I only know what I know, and every historian is stuck with that. You only see a black box, and inside you see little bits of light, according to where you were and what was revealed to you. So I'm not saying what I think is the only viewpoint. But anyway, the left strut, I should do it this way. I'm not sure how it will come out because it looks backward to me, but it probably is that way. The left side of the Y at the top is me and the CBs. The right side is Bob and John Brinsmead, and there's a bit of Parmenter in there. And then the strut, I'm just specifically talking about how Neil Wilson executed Des, and using the Dallas Statement. Now, I've done all this work for Des, an absolutely incredible amount of work that nobody's got any idea about but me, which started when Des was alive. 2014, he and I published 7 books. 3 of them were books on creation. The book on creation was a massive job. Another time I'll tell you what it was like putting that book together. And then 2 versions of it, one for the non-Adventist world and one for the Adventist world. And then I did, that's 3 books. Then I did 3 other books, can't remember which. And then I wrote a book, a little devotional for the women of Rwanda called Jesus Plus Zero, which was a play on Jesus only. And it got published in Kinyarwanda, I think that's what it is, something like that, the language of Uganda and Rwanda. So I did that for the Adventist Christians who were friends of David Kayumba. I did all that year, and then Des started to get sick, having problems with his teeth and so on, and then his eyes. And 2017 I decided to do 3 things because I wanted, Des was getting less, he had more and more problems. I mean, 2018, although he'd had a number of health problems that were quite severe, he did an interview with Peter Dixon, did a great job. And at the end of 2018, Des did his last talk, Assurance You Can Know, which he took at Natalie and Ross Sinclair's house, and about 40 people came to it, and they were absolutely spellbound. This is about 3 months before Des died, and he was going to have surgery. He had surgery on the right eye for a corneal implant. He was going to have surgery on the left eye. So he didn't know if he would survive, and actually that last surgery, I pretty much knew it would do. He was in such a state that it would do for him, and it did, even though it was only a local. And we came home and he said, okay, let's record it. And I had to set up to record it. It took about an hour to do that. And he did it again. Didn't have the audience, so it wasn't quite as good, but it was still pretty good. And then Des wanted to do, I'm rambling, I'm going off piste, but he wanted to do his own funeral on the Shepherd's Psalm. And I even bought him a book. Can't think of the name of the author, but a British psychiatrist that somebody mentioned. Might have been Lynn Bartlett. So I sent for the book, and I'd see him pick up the book and put it down because he'd had another stroke early January, couldn't organise his mind, and he wasn't able to put a sermon together, but he'd done pretty well under the circumstances. So now, let's get down to business. And there's a little bit of history in this, so we're on the left strut of the Y. Talking about Des, from 1958 to 1977. Now, even though I say that, by the next slide I might have gone on to something else. Des went to the seminary in Washington, D.C. in 1958, and he was to do a BD. At Heppenstall's suggestion, he did a master's on the sanctuary, and this took place in 6 months. Then he went to I thought I was off track, but I'm not. Then he was still at the seminary, and his teachers, Earl Hilgert, very fine Christian, Ronald Loseby, he was British, Edward Vick, did not believe in investigative judgment. And Earl Hilgert questioned Des's paper on the Idea principle. And at the same time, Ivan Blazon was there, who was cognizant with all the problems about the sanctuary. So Des goes to a tertiary, the pre-Andrews tertiary institution, and finds that the teachers have thrown out 8044. So he went to Michigan State University in 1958-59. Roy Gaines said he did a doctorate in speech. It's a doctorate in rhetoric, and it was actually on rhetoric and on the Apostle Paul. And there was a great deal of interest in his PhD, and later F.F. Bruce inducted him into the PhD program at Manchester in 1970 on the basis reading that PhD. So he bypassed all the stuff that Norm Young had to go through because he already had a PhD. He'd written a chapter on the history of Paul. That was F.F. Bruce's. Des actually had to repeat that chapter, and later he was glad because F.F. Bruce would have probably determined to have him at Manchester based on that chapter. And in 1960, Des returned to Avondale, and he was head of religion there 1960 to 1970, and then went to Manchester in 72 to 1977, a total of 15 years. And of course, this first time he was married to Gwen. Now, a little bit about my history, not too much, but to tell you how ideas-wise Des and I were like that. I mean, not at the beginning, but there was something on an intellectual level between us, and I'll explain a bit about that. Not that I was super bright, but I picked up things. And anyway, I became an Adventist in 1963 in New Plymouth in New Zealand. And Gwen mentioned later, it was at the same time she first discovered a breast lump. I think it was 63. And I went to college in 1966. I was going to do subjects, and I changed to becoming a Bible worker. I became an Adventist in 1963, and Des's first wife, Gwen, noted that it was about the time that she discovered she had a breast lump. So I went to college in 1966, and I changed from subjects. I was only going to stay for a year because I had a very good job, and I changed to becoming a Bible worker. While I was in the admissions line, I told Ian Giller, who was standing in front of me, and he was a very dramatic and exotic ministerial student, and he said, go to the front desk to Pastor Jorgensen and sign up. And like an obedient girl, I did. So the first year I did 2 subjects that I wouldn't normally have done. First was typing. I could type about 30 letters a minute, but I got up to 60 words a minute that year. And I also went into Daniel and Revelation. This was my first class with Dr. Desmond Ford, right up the street. Now, my minister, Eric Robinson, was a wonderful man in New Plymouth, a saint of God. But I realise now that he was a questions on doctrine, man. And he didn't teach me the sinful nature of Christ, and he taught me a very humane view of Ellen White, mainly taught to me about her at her funeral and how wonderful she was about her husband's death, which impressed me greatly. And when he talked about prophecy, I only remember him talking about America in Revelation, and I had family who were Jehovah's Witnesses, so I went along for a few years before I was 12, so I knew a bit about their ideas, and I thought this was iffy. America in prophecy, highly unlikely. But anyway, he studied with me for 8 months, twice a week, gave me a very thorough background, and I became an Adventist. I went off to college. So I went into DNR. You can imagine, I'd never done any academic work before. I never had wonderful concentration. I've never been top of the class. But when it came to writing the essay, a 40-page essay, of course I'd never done anything like that in my life. I'd gone to grammar school in England and left in my after my O-level year to go to New Zealand. And I decided I want to write an essay on Daniel 11. Most of you will know that that's a very difficult subject, but I always pick difficult subjects because I want to learn something. And I think in the process of it, I'll learn something about it. I'd taken a book with me, the Reader's Digest Bible World, which I only recently realised would be a Catholic book. So, non grata to the Adventists, but never thought about that. And I came across 2 chapters, I think, on the Maccabees. And I read the history of the Maccabees. And in it was about Antiochus Epiphanes. And Des may have mentioned it. Eric Kingdon recently visited and with his wife Joy, and he thought that Des did mention it. But Des had a chart that he used to put up like a dartboard, and he only put in that Babylon, Medo-Persia, the initials thereof, pagan Rome, papal Rome. Didn't have Antiochus Epiphanes at the beginning. So he might have mentioned it a bit, but he certainly didn't make it part of his apotalismatic principle. And it took me years to say that phrase. When I wrote my essay, I didn't mention apotalismatic principle, but the way you say it is apotalismatic. Otherwise, you'll be like Stephen Ferguson and put apostle in the beginning, and it sounds very strange. Apostolic is what he says. Anyway, I wrote an essay. I got to 25 pages and I stopped. I had my own typewriter with me, and I thought, well, I'll get marked down for that. But I got an A. And Des wrote refreshing and something else. I was standing with Robin Priestley and Alvin Tourism, and I said to him, he's given me an A. I said, that can't be right. And Alvin said, oh, he wouldn't do it unless he meant it. Now, Des told me when we were about to get married, and that would be 5 years later, that if he'd written that essay, he would have been fired. But of course, Jill didn't have a clue. And what the essay was about, I looked at this history of the Maccabees and I could see the pattern of Revelation 13, because I'm a pattern person and I make connections. And I thought, that's the pattern of Revelation 13. So that reminded me of what Des had been talking about, the recurring principles. And I wrote my essay on these recurring principles. I didn't call it the apotalismatic principle, but I gave a pretty fair definition of what it was, recurring principles that increase in time until the end when you have, I didn't use the word exacerbation, that was a bit big for me. Until the end, when you get to the man of sin, you have the major fulfillment of this principle. And then I wrote about pagan Rome and papal Rome and went through various Caesars and did the same thing. And apparently, before Des died, he told me that I made a mistake on history, that some of the papal Rome should have been in pagan Rome. And I was going to alter it to correct it, but it was a bit too much for me. But the thing was about that essay, that I had no idea what I'd done, but it made Des notice me. Now, this was in 1966, and I was 21. So it's pretty amazing the way it happened. The only book I possessed was the Reader's Digest thing, which I got through the mail, and I put it in my suitcase as I came from Christchurch. So to me, and to Des, he mentioned it a lot before he died. He told me before he died, so when he read that essay, he thought to himself, someone has understood me. He remembered that Gordon Hammond, there was somebody else talking about Des. They didn't really get his ideas on prophecy, but Jill did, for whatever reason. I got what he was saying. So he noticed me even when I looked at my IQ. Anyway, I've done that slide. I've just told you that from memory. So the following year, when I'd done Daniel and Revelation, done the noticeable essay, which would have got me disfellowshipped, a pastor anybody at the top had known, but I had no idea. And that's been a lot of my experience, that I've said stuff and I had no idea what I was saying. Anyway, the next year I became Des' secretary. That was because Helen Meisner told him he should give me the job. And so I worked from that year, and then he got rid of me. I worked as the sort of the maitre d' in the dining room, a job for which I was not suited. I shouldn't run anything. And that was a learning experience for me. Some of the young men would come in and they would try all sorts of stuff to get in the front of the line. And some people have got diplomacy. I'm not one of them. Anyway, so I used to pop in and see Des. After that, in my third year, 1968, I was assistant dean. Hazel Webb had come from New Zealand. She's the one who said to me, you must go to college. And I became her assistant dean. I think that's right. Vivian Hill, who's now Vivian Vine in England. So I did that for a year. But every so often, not a lot, I'd go and talk to Des. And he seemed to like to talk to me. There's nothing wrong. Well, 1968 at the end, you'll think I'm never getting to Glacier View, and you're probably right. I went to Christchurch, wanted to visit my parents. I'd been at college 3 years. Russell Woolley was at college, the camp cook, and I was chopping vegetables, all I've ever been good for in the cooking realm. And he said to me two things, because they closed the Bible Workers course the first year. I went into certificate teaching, where I was doing cooking, which was absolutely a mistake, and bookkeeping. And at the end of my third year, Russell said to me, why don't you switch over, do an extra year and get your BA. So I didn't have matriculation. I had my O-levels in England, but on the basis of my grade point average, Des and Colin Standish. And I must tell you that Colin Standish thought I was a dut, and he told me so. Told me I was hopeless at teaching, and he graded me very poorly in a subject. He actually brought my grade point average down. C+ and D-, what I got for educational something or other, and educational psychology. And I love these subjects, but what you have to understand is, because I had no Adventist background and no knowledge of Ellen White, I wasn't going to give him the right answers, was I? But anyway, he did speak up for me, and I got to do my final subjects. I'd always wanted to do an art minor, and I was doing art subjects. And I loved French at school. So in my early days, I wanted to be an art teacher, and up came, just in those two years, 1969 and 1970, they offered German and French. It's the only 2 years they ever did it. So I did all my major subjects in the last 2 years. Now, at the beginning of 1968, just after I'd talked to Russell, and I'd said to him, oh, don't be ridiculous. Never occurred to me that I might marry Des Ford, because who was I? I'd come off the street. And I thought he was a holy man. I thought he wouldn't believe in perms. I used to have perms. I used to think he'd think this was very bad for some reason. So I never imagined he'd be interested in me. And anyway, he was married. So the beginning of 68, Gwen has been told that she's not going to live. And of course, she lived longer than thought. She had cancer, and Luke had been born in 66. She'd had a lump in her breast removed in 63. She had Luke, and within months she had pain in the chest, and she got bone in the cancer in the bone. So she was very terminal, had lost a great deal of weight, and she had plans for Des to marry again for the children's sake. And Luke, of course, had been away for 2 years of his short life, 1 year in New Zealand with his Auntie Jean, and he was down with Ken and Eleanor Barrett in Victoria. Before he went down for that second one, Des talked to me at the beginning of 68. I went to see him, and he told me that he was interested in getting to know me better after his wife died, and that they talked about it. And of course it was a bit of a shock. I went into the library crying, and Russell Woolley said to me, "It's Dr. Ford, isn't it?" So Gwen called me, and I went home, and that was the beginning of a great deal of fellowshipping together, which was done in private. She told McDowell and Dr. McDowell and Heffron and Naden. She told her family. She told her sister. I don't think she told her sister at this point, but she wrote letters and said, "Look, stay out of it. This is what I want." So I used to go, I don't know how often it was, but Des would cook breakfast. Gwen would be there with a wheelchair, and we'd get in the combi van, go off to the Watkin, walk for miles, and we often had Luke with us, and I babysat Luke. Gwen wanted to continually wanted Luke to know me. So that was about 18 months before Gwen died. Very unusual. Nothing improper. Whatever was happening, we put it off in our minds. And at the end, when Gwen was really feeble, I backed out. I was actually working at... I didn't intend to say all this, by the way, but I was actually working for Jill Mason's mother in the nursing home, and I helped to care for Gwen. After a while, I had to go back to college. I think that's what it was at the beginning of the year, and they had time on their own, which was proper. So we got married 7 months after Gwen died, and Luke had been away from home for a year. It was all a big rush. I'd been at Lilydale doing practice teaching, I think in October, and Des called me and he said, "We're going to Manchester." I didn't know he was thinking of going to Manchester. He never told me. But he told the division that he had to get away, he would take the next call, but he would like to go to Manchester, and they wanted him back. He was a golden-haired boy. So they agreed that he would go to Manchester. Jill finds out a month before we get married. Didn't have a visa, had to finish my major subjects. My parents knew nothing about this, and we got married the day I graduated. We got married in Doug Elliott's home early in the morning. Breakfast, about 11 people there, including Russell, Woolley and Laurel, and the children. I really felt for them because, it wasn't what they wanted. Ellen had ideas for somebody else to marry her father. She wasn't too happy about me. Luke was away. So we went off for a week, Des and I, and we came back. Luke came home, and we got on the boat and went to England. So you imagine what that was like. I was 26 by then, I think. Anyway, That's that slide, which I've told you extempore. And that one. Oh, okay. At Manchester, after the first 3 weeks, everything Des had to read was in German and a bit of French. So my life was looking after Luke. Paul was at school. It's a bit of a disaster. Not a good experience for Paul in England. I was typing and I was doing German translation, a bit of French. I was making bread and I was running 5 miles a day with my husband. So the Manchester thesis, I typed that twice, once for the PhD on a portable typewriter, and later for publication for the University of America. I wrote it all in Greek and Hebrew by hand, and saved Des a year by the translating. Now, I had terrible PMS, had to use the birth control pill for the first 3 months. I went off it, but it left me with problems half the month, and I got profoundly depressed. A part of it was I just couldn't perform well enough, which you'd understand. I'm just taking a comma out. But it left me with really severe problems half the month for 3 years, till I was about 29. But terrible as it was, it gave me my own ministry for women in USA, which I followed for about 20 years. As I mentioned, Paul had 2 really bad things happen to him outside the family. He told me when he was about 15, when he was leaving home. And, we mourned over this, we knew nothing about it. Paul is a thoroughly decent man, an excellent father. He's been wonderful to me, but these things scarred him. Okay, when I was talking about Russell Woolley and the two things that he told me at the end of 1968, one was about doing a BA, which ended up happening, and the providence of that was that, as I mentioned, they only offered French and German for 2 years, those 2 particular years when I was doing my major subjects. And then you'll remember I went to England with Des, not knowing until a month before I graduated that he was going to Manchester. And so when I got there, I was very useful indeed, because Des knew the Bible pretty much off by heart. Certain passages, he certainly knew the passages he was working on off by heart, because we'd go for bike rides and he would go through the Gospels, Luke 21, Mark 13, Matthew 25, and go from the beginning to the end. He knew it all off by heart. After 3 weeks, everything was in German, so even though I don't think I was terribly good, it was very difficult German, I would spend about an hour a page and translate for him, and he would know what to find because he had enough German from his Bible, but I would come in and give it some finesse. So I ended up saving him a year, and I also said about the thesis that I wrote it all in Greek and Hebrew. I didn't mean to say that. I wrote in all the Greek and Hebrew. It was typed in English. And I did a year of Greek at PUC later. I can't remember any of it, but I do remember writing delugma tes eremosios many times, and that means abomination of desolation, which I called abomination of Des. Anyway, the other thing that Russell said at the end of 1968, when I was helping him in the kitchen at camp in Christchurch, was, when Mrs. Ford dies, Dr. Ford's going to ask you to marry him. And it never occurred to me. Another of these oblivious moments. And I said, oh, don't be ridiculous, because I was a nobody. Just never occurred to me. So it was in 1969, I said 1968, when I went back to college, went over to see Des, And he said to me, when my wife died, she was very terminal. In 1963, she'd found the breast lump, she'd had it removed, she had Luke in 1966. I think I mentioned this before. And 2 months, or 10 months it might have been, after Luke was delivered, she started having pain in her ribs. So she'd lost a tremendous amount of weight, but she did live longer than they expected. They thought she would die imminently, and she lived, well, for about another 14 months. So the time that Des and she and I were sort of going out walking would have been about 14 months, not over 2 years. So the date was 69, not 1968. Now, Des started getting attacked by the CBs from very early. From the time he graduated, he worked in George Burnside's evangelistic team shortly after he graduated. And when Burnside asked his students, asked me a question, any question, Des asked a question about Turkey being king of the north. And Burnside took him aside afterwards and said, "I've heard you've got a big head." Burnside, who knew the story of Des's mother, who had an affair with the president of the Advent Queensland Conference at the time, spread the rumour that Des was a bastard. But Des was a legitimate son of the marriage, and he was 9 at the time of the affair. Burnside called Des Antichrist, who lives at Avondale, and as Ministerial Secretary for the Australasian Division from 1957 to 1971, he often came up and talked to Des's students, because Des didn't go until 60, to get information out of them as to what he was teaching. Now, well, I'm going to talk about Brinsmead on the other side. I just need to give you an idea of what he taught in his early days, because he was very traditional. Robert Daniel Brinsmead in the 1960s taught the Sanctuary Awakening, traditional Adventism with a final blotting out of sins. As he said in his interview, we all know we're not perfect. Well, apparently some people don't, but he did. And so he realised that this had to be a divine gift, supernatural, as perfection in this life was impossible. And in the early 1970s, he switched his views. We'll talk about that more later. After reading Luther's writings on justification by faith, Des had previously urged him to read it. Des had taught justification by faith, and so did Edward Heppenstall, an American professor well known for teaching righteousness by faith. But Heppenstall believed that righteousness by faith was justification and sanctification, included sanctification. He never believed that it was justification alone, which is the Pauline position. So Bob Brinsmead came along, and what he did, Des was teaching justification by faith and living sanctification, teaching it. He always taught sanctification, every sermon. How anybody could say that Des didn't teach sanctification, I do not know. But what Bob did was he clarified what sanctification was not. He said, we're saved by Christ's work plus nothing. Now, historic Adventism, looking at Colin Standish and many others who are traditionalists. Historic Adventism, I've taken this off Wikipedia so you can go and read it. Those conservative individuals and organisations affiliated with Seventh-day Adventism. They preserve traditional beliefs and practices of the denomination. Now, they feel that the Adventist Church has shifted from its key doctrinal pillars since the book Adventists Answer Questions on Doctrine was published in 1957. You've heard people talk about this before. This was written in response to Donald Barnhouse and Walter Martin, who were updating a book on cults and examining whether Adventism was a cult. So this book, QOD, was edited by Leroy Froome, Walter Reed and R.A. Anderson, called Frida. And there were 4 areas. The atonement not completed at the cross. That was the first. 2, salvation is the result of grace, plus the works of the law. 3, Jesus was a created being, not from all eternity, and that Jesus partook of man's sinful, fallen nature at the incarnation. So they qualified those positions, and the traditionalists have never been happy. M.L. Andreasen, you've also heard of him, in the 50s took exception to the following. In Barnhouse's article, it was stated that most Adventists believed in the sinless human nature of Christ, and those who did not were part of the lunatic fringe. Of course, all traditional Adventists who believe that Christ had a sinful human nature would not appreciate being part of the lunatic fringe. I've got a lunatic fringe. I don't know what to do with it. In an article, Froome argued that the atonement was a full and complete sacrifice. He furthermore asserted that the sacrificial act on the cross is a complete, perfect and final atonement for man's sins. Froome still held to the Adventist belief in Christ's work in the heavenly sanctuary, going into the Holy of Holies in 1844 to believe a final atonement for humanity. It's a sort of dual application, which Adventists have believed in when you think about it. So if you want to read this article from Wikipedia, put in Russell Standish and Heritage Adventism, and it will come up as Heritage Adventism, I think, or Historic Adventism, possibly. I've got both here, so I think it's Heritage Adventism. And read it for their history, because they're very, very active, and they'll tell you the groups they got into and so on. Also read a book like Russell Standish. He's written nearly, of the Standishes between them, have written nearly 60 books, and they have their own view of history, and I often go and look at it to see what was going on their side, while we've got our side. It's good to know what the other side's doing. Now listen to this. W.G. Murdoch made a statement at Dallas. Remember, that's where in April 1980, where the Dallas Statement of 27 Fundamental Beliefs was made. He made this statement, which is rather a good one. And he was Des's supervisor. Des was his reader at Avondale when W.G. Murdoch was at Avondale. Then he became dean at Andrews University. Scottish man. Everybody who knew him loved him. So this is what he said. Seventh-day Adventists have always believed in a complete atonement that is not completed. I think that was a bit tongue-in-cheek. He was the Theological Seminary Dean in 1980 at Andrews. So now we come to Herbert Douglas, Kenneth Wood and so on. During the 1970s, what is now the Adventist Review carried articles by the editor Kenneth Wood and his associate editor Herbert Douglas, rejecting questions on doctrine and arguing for a final, perfect generation. The General Conference addressed this controversy over righteousness by faith by holding a conference in Palmdale, California in 1976. Ford was the centre of attention, and the resulting document known as the Palmdale Statement. However, the controversy continued, and critics of the new theology of Ford and others formed institutions to respond to them. The 1975 book Perfection, the Impossible Possibility published by Southern Pub in Nashville in 1975 and edited by Douglas, contained essays by Douglas and C. Mervyn Maxwell supporting the traditional view, and Edward Heppenstall and Hans Larendel supporting the view against perfectionism. So historic Adventist theology tends to differ from mainstream Adventist theology, although in a sense I think that mainstream Adventist theology is more like this than the Gospel Reformation Adventism. It differs in the areas of Christology, hamartiology, which is the doctrine of sin, soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation, and eschatology, which is the doctrine of the end times. And they often use the term new theology as a pejorative term for perceived doctrinal shifts in the church. So they talked about Des and the new theology. With regard to Christology, according to Adventist historian George Knight, most early Adventists believed that Jesus Christ was born with a human nature, but was not only physically frail and subject to temptation, but that he also had the fallen predisposition and inclination to sin. And since 1950, the historic wing of the Church continues to hold this fallen view of Christ's human nature, though it is now a minority position among theologians of mainstream Adventism. Historic Adventists, like mainstream Adventists, believe that sin is defined in terms of personal transgressions of the commandments over against an inborn corruption of the human nature inherited from Adam. So it makes sin acts, violation of the commandments, not nature. Historic Adventists, like mainstream Adventists, believe that sin is defined in terms of I've said that. Historic Adventists tend to place more emphasis on sanctification than justification. Following Andreasen, they define the atonement in terms of God's work to cleanse our character from sin, as well as payment of the penalty for sin. The work of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary is regarded as a continuation of the work of atonement begun on the cross, rather than the applications of the benefits of an already completed atonement. Eschatological perfectionism is the teaching that a final generation of believers must achieve a state of perfection or complete sinlessness in the final period just before the second coming of Jesus. See Last Generation Theology, and most historic Adventists hold to that teaching. This belief in sinlessness arose particularly from M.L. Andreas's interpretation of the investigative judgment doctrine, which is one of the pillars of Adventism and found in the Great Controversy by Ellen White. And people who look at Great Controversy would say it was more Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews who wrote those chapters, but Ellen White agreed to them. And remember, if you want to read this stuff, because I'm reading it, it's from the Wikipedia article about historic Adventists. But if you put in Russell Standish and historic Adventism, the Wikipedia article will come up. And it's worth a read if you don't know much about the issues. Historic Adventists generally place more emphasis on the writings of Ellen G. White as a doctrinal authority compared to mainstream Adventists, some considering her works as infallible and having near equivalent or equivalent status to the Bible. Historic Adventists have a differing perspective on the 1888 Minneapolis General Conference, arguing that Ellen White also supported Jones and Wagner, their perfectionist theology, which some say came from them. Now it's interesting that Wagner left the church because he didn't believe in the investigative judgment. But that's hardly known. Now, some historic Adventists, like many mainstream Adventists, are advocates of the King James only movement, which promotes sole use of the King James version of the Bible. And of course, what Des used to say was, if it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me. The classic book in this movement, Our Authorised Bible Vindicated, was written by an Adventist, Benjamin G. Wilkinson, and critiqued by Alden Thompson. Milton calls this Adventist fundamentalism. So now we're finished with telling you the background of why people got upset. Now, I've called this slide, Gillian Adds Petrol to the Fire. Gillian was an arsonist, but she had no idea. In early to mid 1975, Jill, having read This Is What I Think Happened, and I've only recently come to this because I thought I wrote this book in 1977, so elsewhere I have given a different story. This is what I think happened, having to work it out. Jill, having read Herbert Douglas's chapter in the book Perfection, The Possible Possibility, I do remember reading it, reacted by writing the material implications of the human nature of Christ. She was teaching the Sabbath school. Des and I were both teaching it alternately for the young marrieds in the village church. And in this book, she did a chart on the true and the false gospel, and I labelled Herb Douglas's traditional Adventism the false gospel. She'd come into the denomination with a post-Andreasen approach to the nature of Christ. I'm speaking in the third person, but I did not know that the sinful nature of Christ was part of the teachings of traditional Adventism. And there'd be a lot of people like me who came in who had a post-questions on doctrine teacher and never learnt the traditional view. Some questions about when I wrote it. As I said, I thought it was 1977 because I was teaching the lesson, about to teach a lesson by Herb Douglas, and his pamphlet, Jesus the Model Man, on this subject came out in the second quarter of 1977, with his book, Jesus the Benchmark of Humanity, on the same topic. Now, I borrowed his word, benchmark, I liked it, and in all my histories of Glacier View, I've used the word benchmark of the Dallas Statement, and I'll mention that later. So I did read those books later, but that's not when I wrote this little booklet. I thought, I had a lot of time to think about this, a lot of time to go over it year by year and come back and talk to Des. Even in 2017, I learned a lot about Glacier View because I was writing stuff, he was adding to it, and he also talked to me about various things that I didn't know. So I've been providentially prepared to do these talks recently, comparatively recently. I've worked on it. I've thought about Glacier View every day since it happened. It's never far away. But anyway, I'd written somewhere, I think possibly on the yellow-covered book or maybe on the original soteriological implications that they duplicated, which I would have handled with Des's documents last year. And I had the date 1975, and I was thinking, I couldn't work it out. Why would I suddenly write about it then? And then I thought, maybe I read that book, Perfection Impossible. I knew I'd read it, and I think that was it. I was horrified by Herb's chapter. I'd never heard of the sinful nature of Christ. I found it shocking. But I also went back and looked at the Sabbath School Quarterlies because I thought, I wonder if he wrote an earlier Sabbath School pamphlet. Sure enough, he did, and it was called Faith in Action, and it was put out in the third quarter of 1975, when I would have been teaching Sabbath School. So I'm about to teach this Sabbath School. I've got that in my mind. I was about to teach a lesson by Herb Douglas I'd read this stuff, and so I think I wrote this brochure in about May 1975. I'm pretty sure I did, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I was absolutely driven to write that brochure. Stayed up several nights to do it, no sleep. Only time in my life I've ever done that. And after I wrote it, did the lesson, kept on looking after Luke and Paul and making the bread, and I sort of entered into theology every 10 years. There's his introduction to theology class, and later I did his biblical theology, because I studied education. I'm not a theologian. A lot of what I've picked up from listening to him. And, for instance, I've never read questions on doctrine, ever. It wasn't anything to do with questions on doctrine that made me write soteriological implications. After that, this little booklet had a life of its own, because Des wrote some questions and answers in the back. He showed it to the members of the religion department. Now, who would have been there then? I know David Curry was there, but they all liked it. So they duplicated it and got into trouble by Keith Parmenter. It must have been 1976, because we were gone in 77. Said to Des, this should have gone through the BRI. You shouldn't be publishing articles out of Avondale. So that's where he first found out that I was a very bad girl indeed. Never talked to me, ever. Well, he did once, but like for 2 minutes. But nobody ever said to me, why did you write that book? They just got annoyed with me. Anyway, it had a life of its own. It got into the village. People didn't like it. The CBs, they'd started, well, I'll get on to that later, what they were doing, but it was in the middle of this buzz. And it must have been sent down to Melbourne or given to Russell Standish. I'm not quite sure where he was. And then later, while we were in America, so it will be I think while we were at PUC, it might have been after PUC, but it would be 77 to 79. David Curry, whenever he was in England, he published it, and he changed my title. He took out the word soteriological, which is very sensible, but I sort of like it. He called it The Human Nature of Christ and Salvation. And then Jack Mallory, who was a dentist, Paradise, California, sent to David Curry and got the originals, and he covered it and published it in America. Small distribution, I'm sure. But anyway, as I say, it had a life of its own, and I never thought about it much after that. Anyway, we'll come back to it, but I've now gone on to a list of concerned brethren. This is the list I've got, which I think I got from Peter Marks, and I hope I've got it right. George Burnside, Austin Cook, J.B. Keith, J.W. Kent, O.K. Anderson, Pastor Heggie, I should look his name up, A.L. Jacobson, Walter Ferris, Frank Braden, Raglan Marks, who bankrolled the CBs, put in $1,000 a year. I've got that noted somewhere. It's a lot of money back then. And proud of it. And Peter Marks is very proud of it. I want Peter to know it didn't do us any good. But anyway, he's very proud of his elect relatives. Separate but sympathetic were Russell and Colin Standish, and John Clifford, of course, but there were many people who supported them. Russell came home, I'm not sure which year it was, it could have been 75, and at first he was quite sympathetic with Des, but then he listened to the CBs, and he and Colin were very sympathetic with the old Brinsmead, because it was perfectionistic, and they didn't like it when he switched to his gospel emphasis. So then we have the publication of the conflicting concepts of righteousness by faith in the Australasian division, which originally only about 15 copies were published, but I believe later, maybe years later, I don't know, it was available online. The Standish brothers and John Clifford joined the CBs. They specialised in salvation issues. As I said, they'd been supportive of Bob in his perfectionist days in the 1960s. The Sanctuary Awakening, they were distressed when he began preaching on Luther. And in response to the agitation over righteousness by faith with Bob Brinsmead and the pamphlet put out by me on the nature of Christ, Russell Standish and John Clifford published Conflicting Concepts of Righteousness by Faith in the Australasian Division in January 1976. And I know that he read my book because in Russell's book, Gathering Storm, he stated that I sounded like Fletcher. And of course, I didn't know anything about M.L. Andreasen, questions on doctrine. I knew nothing about Fletcher. I'd just been taught the gospel view and the sinless nature of Christ, and then I read Herbert Douglas's view and Maxwell's view, and it was so different. And I thought, now this shows my ignorance, I thought there was a little group at the top who believed this that were heretical. If I had any idea that it was traditional Adventism, I think I certainly wouldn't have done that chart. Because underneath this dour, this austere front, I've actually got quite a soft heart. I wouldn't have wanted to hurt them. Anyway, they sent 3 copies to Pastor Pearson, Kenneth Wood and Duncan Eva at Palmdale. And Pearson and Wood replied affirmatively. Now, so there's a link from my writing that booklet to Standish's writing theirs, and the letter of Pearson in 1980 on the Thursday afternoon, where he copiously used it. It seems to borrow ideas from conflicting concepts. And then, of course, George Burnside published Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrines, and I need to put in the date he did it, but it was around this time. And the text of conflicting concepts on salvation was echoed in George Burnside's Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrines, the comments on righteousness by faith, and also, as I said, it was repeated in Pastor Pearson's letter read out at Glacier View to all the delegates. And what his Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrine was about, and I've just done brief notes. 1, the age of the earth, using Ellen White quotes, 6,000 years. The 7 trumpets, from Great Controversy, pages 334, 335, the fall of the Ottoman Empire in August 1840. The fall of Turkey exactly fulfilled the prediction. 3, Dr. Ford downgrades Uriah Smith's Daniel Revelation. Absolutely accurate. 4, questions on biblical inspiration. The Bible is not unerring. Des said it was only for salvation, not geographical, chronological, historical, geological or scientific subjects. Again, that would be right. 5, Ford rejects the truth of a real 2-apartment sanctuary in heaven, and Burnside used Ellen White to prove this. 6, 4 methods of interpretation: historicism, which means you look at history in your time to interpret, like the book of Revelation. Preterism, you look at the original writers and what it meant then. All scholars use preterism, so it's no good. Gerhard Hausel used preterism. He's a traditional Adventist. But it's the method of scholarship, because you can't use the supernatural in State University PhDs. You've got to treat it like a historical document. So there's historicism, preterism, futurism, everything's at the end. That's Plymouth Brethren, the rapture, etc. And idealism, not too sure about that. And Des said all of these are limited. There's some truth in each, and they've all got problems. 7, Des said the finished work of Christ was complete at the cross. George Burnside claims that is Plymouth Brethrenism, And he uses Ellen White's quote to support Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. So he's talking about the investigative judgment. 8. Desmond Ford downgrades imparted sanctification. Des says the impartation of righteousness is like a teaspoon compared to the mighty ocean of imputed righteousness. And amen, I say to that, but George Burnside didn't like it. Like a sprinkle of a salt shaker compared to the mighty salt mines of the world. Number 9, this is George Burnside's Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrine. Some of you haven't seen this, but it's an important document on the traditional side. Concerned brethren who Bob Parr called Groff, getting rid of Ford. 9. Righteousness by faith is justification alone. Righteousness in us comes at the second coming. That's not true. He's misquoted Des there. Christ's righteousness provides for our past sins. We are justified by our imputed righteousness. His righteousness provides for daily victorious living. We are sanctified by his imparted righteousness. His righteousness provides for a glorious future in his sinless kingdom. This is glorification. And he quotes Pearson, We Still Believe, as a source, page 203. Jesus sits as a refiner and purifier of his people. When his image is perfectly reflected in them, they are prepared for translation. Ellen White, Testimonies 1, page 340. And then at the bottom he has, that which we have, hold fast till I come. Revelation 2:25. So I told you what George Burnside's Dangerous Doctrines was about. Conflicting concepts, when you read it, is actually very much a works righteousness. Justification for past sins, and now it's up to us, with the Holy Spirit, to progress in sanctification and to become perfect in this life, particularly at the end time. So that's, you can go back and find conflicting concepts. You can, I've told you what's in George Burnside. That was what they were about. We're still on the first Y strut. And we're using the letter Y. It doesn't mean the W-H-Y. We're doing the how. What were the forces that brought Des to Glacier View? We've looked at me. I was one of the forces. I caused some of the trouble. When I became an Adventist and came and wrote a miraculous essay, which I didn't know had anything in it, but Des liked it. And then when I'd been married for 5 years and came back from England, I wrote the Theological Implications, which upset a lot of people. So we're now looking at the Concerned Brethren. And there are a number of meetings that the Concerned Brethren had with the division in Australia between 1970 and 76 or 77. There were 3 meetings that I know of anyway. There was an earlier meeting of the CBs with Des at the division in 1970 before we got married. But on the 3rd to the 4th of February 1976 there was a hearing by 20 men from the Biblical Research Institute in the Australasian Division, now the South Pacific Division of Complaints from the CBs. It was a group of 16 men, 11 senior ministers, all retired, and 5 laymen. I don't have all those names. I have a list that I gave before, but it's certainly not 16 men. It included James William Kent, 1890 to 1983, died when he was 93, a veteran Australian evangelist and administrator, and George Burnside, 1908 to 1994, a New Zealand evangelist, and Raglan Marx, as we said before, bankrolled the operations to bring down Des. George Burnside was told when he got irate about Des and he was aged, be careful because you might have a heart attack. And he said, I couldn't think of a better way to go. And it was Bob Parr who called them Groff, get rid of Ford, versus fish. Ford is staying here. And people who think that Groff is an insult, to remember we were insulted by being called fish. Who wants to be called a fish? In March 1977, Kent and others, this is another meeting, met with Ford and all the church administrators, all the administrators that Robert Frame could bring in. They were informed this was the last time they could meet with church leaders as a group. Every time Des was cleared, he would go down on the train with a suitcase full of Adventist publications, and he would answer their questions, open all the books, answer it from stuff that had been published by Adventists. So some of their concerns, and I've gone over that, concern about that Des was teaching theology, particularly in the area of sanctuary, the age of the earth and inspiration. And so he was polluting all the young ministers. Frank Braden was one of the CBs. He was always friendly to Des. He was a real Christian, never antagonistic like some of the others. His particular concern was inspiration. He went to college twice. And the first time, A.F.J. Kranz taught typewriter inspiration. And Des taught a more modern biblical view, that the Bible is perfect for its purpose. However, Frank Braden didn't realise that A.F.J. Kranz in private would have agreed with Des. He wrote 2 amazing letters to Des in 1956 and 1958, and I think I read part of them on my 2 1987 podcasts. Kranz didn't believe in the investigative judgment. He thought our views on Ellen White's inspiration were wrong. That was what the 2 letters were about. Didn't believe in the investigative judgment, and the other one was about Ellen White. And in the middle, in 1957, Des responded, and at that time Des was fairly conservative. He didn't believe, for instance, in Antiochus Epiphanes. He never thought, anyway, that Antiochus Epiphanes was the main interpretation of the Little Horn. He believed he was a prototype at the time that Daniel was written, or thereabouts, a prototype of evil to be revealed recurrently in the future, and in the end, in a bigger picture. He gave a picture of what evil looked like, so that people would be prepared. Now we're on the other strut, and I'll do the why, and it's this one. Finally got the way of doing the strut. So it's taken me quite a while to get through the first strut. Hopefully this one won't take as long. So now we're looking at Brinsmead. We looked at him a little bit. He was leading the Sanctuary Awakening message in the 1960s. Essentially, he taught traditional Adventism, but he added a supernatural blotting out of sins at the end of time for Adventist saints living without a mediator. He said it wasn't possible to be perfect in this life, and this supernatural divine act was the only way out of the dilemma. The awakening agitation in the churches caused a lot of division and chaos, and it was considered in the 60s that Des, who'd for 30 years done the Bible answers, the Q&A in the back of the Signs of the Times, saved Avondale from losing any students to Brinsmead. And as a reward for this, he was sent to Manchester. But this was sort of turned around. I mean, Des saw Bob occasionally when he was on different sides, and he was trying to talk him around. Only part of that time did he agree with him. But he was always remained friends. A lot of people found that hard to believe. But in 1980, all that work of Des helping the division with Bob was interpreted that he was complicit and colluding with Bob. It wasn't true. In fact, Keith Parmenter was colluding with John Brinsmead, as I'll show you in a bit. That was allowed because he was the president. And in 1970, while we were at Manchester, Des was called to General Conference, to meetings with Pearson and others, and Bob and John Brinsmead. And some time afterwards, Bob wrote to Des and said they'd given up the Awakening. Now, Des had told Bob before a number of times that he should go and read Luther and the Reformers when they were discussing eschatology. However, Bob says that he read Luther for himself and found the gospel. Also, there's a story that the Pope was coming to Australia in December 1970, and Bob wanted to debate a priest. And the priest explained Luther's views to him, and Bob realised that Adventists were tridentine in their views of salvation. Tridentine means teaching Catholic theology, justified by faith, but that process included regeneration. The Catholics believe in justification by grace, but it's imparted into the believer. It includes regeneration. So justification becomes an experience. And I'll talk more about justification later. So in the early 70s, Bob was promulgating material on Luther and the Reformers, changed the name of his magazine to Verdict, which Fleetwood Mac coined, and he became a proponent of righteousness by faith, justification by faith alone. Des and Edward Heppenstall had taught righteousness by faith in the 50s and 60s. They were both known for it. But Bob honed Des's understanding in this respect. Mentioned it before, but it's important. Bob said sanctification in the sense of Christian growth was not justification. He said salvation was Christ plus nothing. Bob preached righteousness by faith clearly, often and in depth in the 1970s. Ted Heppenstall believed righteousness by faith included justification and sanctification until the day he died. And Fleetwood Mac has 2 podcasts from Loma Linda where Paxton and Heppenstall are interchanging on this issue. And Des comes in, and Des is really clear. He's very, very good. If you contact Fleetwood Mac, he might give those podcasts to Peter to put up. They're worth listening to if you want to understand the nitty-gritty of the problems with justification by faith. Now, in late 1978, and I'm going by what Bob said here, Bob was in USA, and he visited Heppenstall and Des in California. Got a vague memory of this, but I think he visited Heppenstall down south, probably drove up and then talked to Des. And he talked to both of them about 1844, and he asked them both separately. You know, particularly Heppenstall, he was retired. He said, "You've got clout, you could bring it out," and he wasn't comfortable doing it. He said to Bob, apparently, "What do you think about this investigative judgment thing?" And he shook his head. And his students in class seemed to think he had questions on it too. You notice what Coffin said about Heppenstall, a Glacier View. And then he went, apparently asked Des doesn't remember this, to address it. And Des said it had opened a can of worms, he had enough trouble on his plate as it was. But Des is somebody you can give an idea and he'll think about it, and he possibly, that did happen. Bob Brinsmead said it did, and Des would have thought about it. I've known Des, I'll suggest something to him about writing a book, and it might be 2 years later, like Jesus Only, and he'll come to me and say, "I've worked out how to do that book." So he likes to think about things. But at that time, this would be late 1978, neither of them were keen to address it. So Bob went home and he wrote 1844 Re-Examined against the investigative judgment, and it was published in July 1979. Now, at that time, Des was given 3 months off. And all these things, I'd suddenly find out the day before, Des had 3 months off. You know, he was so busy. He was hardly there. He was away 3 weekends a month. He did 2 weeks of prayer. They had a committee to cut down Des's meetings, and he ended up getting 3 meetings a week. They just made sure that 2 of them were in the state of Northern California and Hawaii. Very, very busy. Teaching 16 hours, writing, going away most weekends. It was me and Luke on the weekends. Anyway, Des had 3 months, and you remember Roy Gain mentioned Greta Hartelius, who used to have us over for Thanksgiving and Christmas every year and bring in people like Nils Eric. Roy and Connie Gain came often. That's how we got to be great friends. Greta was the queen of hospitality, and we had wonderful times there. But anyway, she made her a house. We were up on the hill in Anglewood, California, a steep hill down a small mountain, about 8 miles, and she had an apartment in St. Helena. Des had a bike. He'd go down the hill at the beginning of the week, probably Sunday, and he'd probably by car, she'd taken all his commentaries, and he had them in different rooms in her house. And when he was writing a chapter, he'd go through from one room to another and put together that book. And then at the weekend, Des would bike up the hill. And let me tell you, Des never had to get off his bike. He went up that hill, 8 miles uphill, without getting off it. He was very, very fit. And at the beginning of doing that commentary in early summer 1979, he had to go to Washington, D.C. for meetings. I don't know whether it was BIRI. They only had one set of meetings, which I will refer to later, on the BRI. It was possibly that. But anyway, while he was there, he went to the Library of Congress. Whenever Des went to a town, he'd always go to the big libraries and ransack them. And he handled all the commentaries that they had on Revelation. Now, some were from the early centuries of AD, like 4th century AD, and 16th century, like Luther, and so on. And he found, I don't know exactly what the books were, but he handled most of them. And he found that those that used historicism, that saw the end of things coming in their time, read the book of Revelation like a newspaper, as though it was current events. Some from the early centuries. There was an early one, I think the 4th century, but I'm not sure, that when Nero was 666. And in the 15th century, Luther saw the plagues falling in Europe as the plagues from the book of Revelation. He believed he was preaching the third angel's message, get the picture, and Des had this realization. It amplified in his mind that Adventists had done the same in the 19th century. They'd applied, the book of Revelation to the 1800s, and what happens? Time passes, it becomes less important, it's passé, and I think what he'd say about historicism was that everybody living is meant to look at the book of Revelation, see the principles of good and evil, the gospel, and Satan working in the book of Revelation, but it's not set in concrete in one century. And as I say, it becomes passé. And, we're 180 years, I think. Might have it wrong, but I think it's about 180 years since investigative judgment. And you can't have anything else fulfilling. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, when Des was writing Crisis, and of course what he did with that, I typed it twice, once for publication because then we didn't have computers. We just typed the pages and they got photocopied by a printer and made into a book. I did that with 2 things. There's a thesis. Don't think I Did I type it twice? It was two things I typed twice. Big manuscripts. Yeah, it was. I did his Manchester thesis twice. Once for publication by the University of America. Anyway, while Des was writing this crisis, this commentary on Revelation, he said, I'll probably lose my job over the positions I've taken in this book. Now, that was finished in September 1979. Wasn't published until possibly 1982, because once Des lost his credentials, they weren't going to publish his books, were they? October 1979, Wayne Judd and Adrian Zukoski asked Des to take the October 27, 1979 forum meeting to answer Bob's book, 1844, Re-Examine. And Des said, oh, it'll cause trouble. And they said, well, you'll be protected by forum. And it was true that people could say anything in forum, and they'd never been disciplined over it. And anyway, he agreed to the talk. And I think that Jack Castle was over in the Orient, somewhere in Asia. So he didn't even know about this. So when he did the talk, quite a few people thought the meeting was okay. Something like 70 or 80%. I was reading something yesterday that gave that figure, but I don't know what I was reading. And Des was actually, as Graham Bradford said, he was saying, here are the problems, and here's how we can answer it. Now, you need to understand with Des that when he's saying here are the problems, those problems were largely agreed on by many scholars. When you come to Des's solutions, they weren't too sure about those, but they never came up with anything better. And Des was saying at Glacier View, look, I'm not going to mess around. We know the problems. Here are my solutions. What do you think? And what's your ideas? And he said at Glacier View, they gave him nothing. They gave him nothing. Now, Doug Hackelman, who's been on here, has written 34 chapters. I've read them. I've been privileged to read them, of the Cottrell family, 3 generations. And I think it's the first one. There's an uncle in there, Roswell Cottrell. He's not in the same line. But I actually think it's Ray Cottrell's grandfather who worked with Ellen White, Uriah Smith. So his story is independently very important because of the politics of the time. And then his father was a missionary, and then Ray Cottrell, his story. Now, the thing that impressed me when I read it, and it was a number of years ago, Doug had some financial problems with the global financial debacle, so it got put on the side, and I hope now again he will take it up. Every so often I write to him because I say, you can't presume that you will live to the age of your mother. I think she died at 104 or 107, and you might be hit by a bus, so you really need to finish that book. But the thing that impressed me was that the problems that Des raised, now, he probably did it better, and I'll expand on that, why he would do it better, because of his training. And Des's very nature, the way he read, it'd be very hard for people to catch up with the amount Des read, because from a child, he read 5 hours a day. He was phenomenally knowledgeable. You only had to be around him. When I was at university and I was studying, every subject Des knew something about. He already knew a lot. So Des was an autodidact. He taught himself a lot. He was widely read, as Roy Gain pointed out. You don't have to be right, but if he says something, he's really worked on it. You should listen to what he says. But anyway, Doug Hackelman's book. It shows the same problems that Des faced have come up all through. And he gives all the names of the people. What happens is they get put out. I mean, Prescott almost got put out because he had big questions on the investigative judgment. Wagner left, People don't know that. They talk about Jones and Wagner. He's almost got holy status, but he left on the investigative judgment. So this has been going on. I told you about all the men at Andrews. And you get a sense from reading Cottrell's book that this has been a problem right from the beginning of the church. And the church has never addressed it. What it does is it reboots, goes back as though nothing had ever been raised. It's done this with Ellen White. It was fairly honest in the 1980s about Walter Ray. But now we're back again at square one. Des was just the latest. And he had a bigger audience, and he had maybe better communication skills. He's a brilliant orator, as they keep saying. And what's happened is the Conservatives have had the grasp of the church, and they just fire people. They carry on as though nothing has happened. I mean, Des pretty much, to the generation that Stephen Ferguson, they knew nothing about, and the church has done a great job of blanketing any knowledge of Des Ford. So lay people don't know about this, that this is an ongoing problem that the church will not address. Now, John Brinsmead. John Brinsmead, they were talking about, well, not quite sure. I think he was talking to Parmenter all along the way, because Parmenter's letters to Des, there is a number of them, refer to stuff about Brinsmead, and Des is being affiliated with him, and it goes over years. Anyway, when Bob published his book on Against 1844, John Brinsmead went down to visit Claude Judd, who was the Trans-Tasman Union president, and he took him along to see Parmenter. Now, in 2006, I want to mention this, a number of letters were written to Arthur Patrick and Milton Hooke, castigate them because they did a 25th anniversary of Glacier View, and it was published in Spectrum, and it was rather negative towards Keith Parmenter. And Byrne, his son, and wrote a letter on the GC letterhead. His mother, Heather, wife of Keith Parmenter, wrote a note. Ron Taylor wrote a 2-page article, and Neil Wilson wrote a 2-page letter. Very clever. All backing Parmenter and saying that all this stuff about John Brinsmead was a pack of lies. Well, Trevor Lloyd interviewed I'll tell you how I came to find out about it, but the actual fact is that Trevor Lloyd interviewed Claude Judd after Glacier View, and he also interviewed John Brinsmead, and they both said it happened. And there was a written statement. I don't know whether John said, but Claude said he was in the meetings with Bob Brinsmead and Parmenter, and wrote a statement, which Trevor at the time called an affidavit, that what he said was true. And essentially what he said was that Des and Bob were in cahoots. They were working separately. Bob had written his book. Des had done the forum. So this would be stated after that meeting. So then they were going to join together and destroy the church. And see, I heard this rumour. I don't know what's true because you hear stuff. And I've never talked to John Brinsmead. I've never met him. I've seen him from the distance once. This is typical of my interactions with these people who've got so much to say about me. They don't know me and they've never talked to me. Like Athol Tolhurst told somebody told Graham Bradford that I was either a troubleshooter or a troublemaker. And I said to Graham, how did he know? He's never talked to me. I said, it's true, but how did he... Anyway, where did I get to? So anyway, Claude Judd said it happened, and John Brinsmead said it happened. So I'm sorry, Vern and your mum and Ron Taylor and Neil Wilson. It did happen. I don't know what else to say about that. But anyway, there were several letters from Keith Parmenter beginning in June 1978, 11 months after we left Australia for PUC. And you remember we went for 2 years, which mentioned Brinsmead rumours, but one in September 1979 mentioned Des helping Bob with the 1844 book, which he didn't, and I think that came from John Brinsmead. And also there was a letter saying that Des had helped edit the Paxton book. None of this was true. None of it was true. But John was angry with his brother, and he didn't like Des because Paul, our son, stayed with, when his mother was sick, stayed with John Brinsmead, and he didn't treat Paul well. And Paul told me that John Brinsmead used to follow him around, criticising his father and saying, he's wrong, he's wrong. Anyway, he told all this stuff to Parmenter, and I can't tell you for certain what he said, but some of it's true. And I'll tell you more. So the story was that Des and Bob were in cahoots, and Des could say that he wasn't because I was the mediator. Look, I hadn't even read Verdict. I could tell you a story. I'm very little, so I wasn't widely read in Brinsmead. I've heard him talk to Des when they've gone on walks together, and I knew what Des said he taught and so on. I never had any contact. Yeah, I went down with somebody from America who wanted to see Bob and talk to Bob, and had a lovely time. He's very affectionate towards me, and I helped arrange the interview. I don't think he would have done it if I hadn't called and asked him if he would do it. But I wasn't in contact with Bob. Anyway, Eric Magnuson told me in 2000 when I came back from Australia, I said, these rumours about Bob, where did they come from? He said, well, they were rife around Australia before Glacier View. But see, I was in Australia living. I had no idea. And I heard rumours on the floor at Glacier View that Bob was either hiding in the camp or close by. And I was calling out. I can tell you who I was calling. Calvin Edwards, I think Noel Mason, Ray Mitchell, who was up in Oregon, and Zane Kime. I never called Bob Brinsmead. But anyway, I was seen calling out on the phone. They presumed I was calling Bob. And look, they believed it. They never asked me. Anyway, Brinsmead, I can't recall, because we weren't part of Glacier View. No, we were basically, I was wandering around talking to any stray scholars who weren't at the meetings. But we didn't attend the small groups. We were in the full meetings, and we weren't allowed to speak out. I mean, Des later was, Heppenstall wanted him to speak, so he answered questions in the late afternoon, and I think that turned out to be a bit of a disaster, because the people who should have asked the questions were at the back. I can remember Fritz Guy laughing at Bill Shea, something Bill Shea was saying. They're all giggling together. I think it was Arthur Furch and Ethel Tolhurst, and they baited Des, and he was like a terrier in a corner. It would have been a good idea if they hadn't done that. But anyway, they did. So Brinsmead, I don't think, was mentioned at all in the main meetings, but he was huge in the Friday afternoon session with Prexad. And Des was asked about his collusion with Bob. Neil Wilson said that they colluded together. Des had given permission for Bob to send out 50,000 cassette tapes of the forum. Now, Des and I both remember that figure independently. It wasn't mentioned in the ministry in 1980. Now, Des was visibly pleased to think that 50,000 of his tapes had gone around the world. No wonder they thought he was arrogant. But he didn't know anything about it. And when Wilson said, it's not a good response, he said, well, they might do something good. You gotta love him. One of the 4 conditions in Parmenter's letter, it didn't appear in the version, I believe, published in the October 1980 ministry. I've got October 1979, but it was the following year, was that Des write a piece in the review and distance himself from the activity of Bob Brinsmead. This he refused to do, because Bob was preaching righteousness by faith at the time, and he called him a brother minister. And the other condition Des could not agree to was that he must not just put his views in his pocket, but say he was wrong and change his mind. And Des said he couldn't do those 2 things if they gave him 100 years, 1,000 years, because they gave him 2 weeks. And he said, I couldn't do it. So the aftermath of this, in 1988, because we're speaking about this John Brinsmead issue, and I wanted to know what it was about, because I was the bad woman, and I'd also written Soteriological Implications, see, 2 bad things. I was always mystified about these rumours and the discussion in Prexad on the last Friday afternoon meeting. What was this Brinsmead story all about? The leaders never disclosed it before, during, they never have. So 1988, 8 years after Glacier View, I took Aline Cherry and Marion Fritz up to see Ellen, Dennis' daughter. I was over from America and I had a hire car. We stopped off to see Vern and Edna Heiss, and the car broke down outside Port Macquarie, so we got a new hire car, and Vern said, I'll drive you. Horrific driver, nearly killed us. On the way back from Brisbane, Vern said, let's stop in and see Bob. So it wasn't planned. So I took the opportunity to say to Bob, what were all these rumours about? And he said, oh, I know all about that. Bob was unhappy with my writing the book against 1844, and he went down to Parmenter about it. Now, in 2007, 27 years after Glacier View, I decided to write a history of the forum tapes and who sent them out. I spoke to Bob Brinsmead by email, Norman Jarnes on the phone for an hour, Jack Swamer by email, per Laura Shaw. He talked to Brett Jennings, not related to Dean, who did a lot of Des's tapes in America. Now, I'll give you a challenge. Find me a tape from Verdict of the October 27 forum. You won't be able to find it because the sending out of 50,000 tapes never happened. I talked to Dean Jennings doing this article. He recorded the forum meeting, but he only sent out 7. He was very cautious, which was unlike Dean. He'd send anything out to anybody. One of them he sent to Norman Young, so of course Norman thought that all of them were sent out by Dean, but he said he only sent out 7. A certain tape sound library at PUC, I talked to them, I talked to the lady who ran that for an hour. She denied sending it out in bulk. They had a lending library, so they'd send out a tape of Des's. It was all Des's tapes. People liked it, they send in the money and they keep it. And then they'd replace it and so forth. I asked Avondale and PUC libraries if they could photograph their cassettes and found out that they were from a ministry in New Mexico. So I called the pastor, the Adventist pastor of the church in New Mexico, who was ex-Andrews University, and quite surprised to hear from me. But he knew nothing about it. It wasn't in his time. And in the end, Adu Worku, who was an Ethiopian librarian, PUC, who loved Des, like Germa Damptey, and he put a worker on the plot, and he found some correspondence from this ministry, and it was a person called Don Croxton. And once he said that, I knew who it was. We knew him. He'd been to some of Des's meetings in the States, and he had a small home ministry, home church, and they sent out tapes. Now, I contacted my friend Greta, who was the one who was very hospitable to the Gaines, etc. She looked in the phone book. I found stuff online. I found Don Croxton's son found his obituary, so he died in 2002, found his son and wrote him a letter. He didn't reply, but he called his mother and said, "You did send out those tapes," because she had some memory loss. And then I talked to his wife 2 or 3 times on Skype. And she thought she'd just destroyed all the records. They'd had records back from about 1950, and another son the week before had said to her, "Why have you got all these records?" So she destroyed them, or otherwise she could have told me the exact numbers, but she said it would have only been about 1,000. And the tape said on the label to copy and distribute them. They gave them permission, and people did. And Rob and Florence Thompson and Des Dillon were 2 in Australia who sent out many, many tapes. So, like John Brinsmead's accusations about Des and my collusion with Bob, the 50,000 tapes mentioned in the Prexad meeting were fictitious. It never happened. We believed it for 27 years because Neil Wilson said so. And wouldn't you believe the General Conference President? But it seems that John Brinsmead had told Keith Parmenter this, Keith Parmenter had told Neil Wilson, they never told us, they didn't disclose anything to us, and it wasn't true. But it was, it was part of the ammunition to get rid of Des. There are a number of things that they used. I'll probably get to those somewhere. In 2007, looking for the history of the cassettes, I told Bob Brinsmead that he'd already mentioned his brother John in the 1844 book in 1988. So he sent me an email, and he put the story in writing. And when Bob speaks and writes, he's got a prophetic demeanour. The family looked on him as a prophet, and the same with his sister Hope. So he speaks as a prophet. And I gave this to Milton. So Milton has written evidence on both sides, the transcripts of the talks with John Brinsmead and Claude Judd, and the statement of Bob Brinsmead, who said this is what happened. So I never wanted to go to John Brinsmead and talk about it. There was some unpleasantness in the way he dealt with Paul, and I just didn't want to do that. And I don't know exactly what's true, but that's my side of the story of what happened. And yes, well, I've already done that bit, so we won't go over that. But the point is, we never colluded with Bob, and Bob made that clear. Des and he never colluded. But Keith Parmenter definitely colluded with John Brinsmead, even though it's denied by the family. Now, Parmenter plots. This was promised by Duncan Eva and Keith Parmenter that he could come back to Avondale in 2 years. And I recently, like this week, found a letter from Eric Magnuson saying this officially. Now, I'd found it before, it's part of the documents that I've copied, but I found it again. He said that we've had this talk, you're coming back in 1979. We're going to miss you, but PUC will be blessed, etc. And we left the PUC in July 1978. Now, Keith Parmenter wanted Des out of the field. He said he was a big fish in a little pond in Australia. He would be a little fish in a big pond in USA. Well, it didn't work, because when we got to America, even though locally they treated us, they took a lot of rumours that we were Brinsmeadites. And Roy's dad, Irwin, did everything he could to stop Des coming. But anyway, in the field, there wasn't much opposition to Des, so Des went everywhere. He went to all the major colleges except Southern, but a number of the faculty lost their jobs after Glacier View, and they were actually quite sympathetic. So, but I guess the administration didn't want him, but he went to all the major colleges, and he went up to New York and down to Mexico, not Mexico, to the border, southern border, speaking everywhere, going over to the east and so on. And did that for pretty much till 1980, when, of course, all that got stopped. But Parmenter's idea that Des was a little fish in a big pond just didn't work. Des spread his influence, whatever you think of it, across America. And in June 1978, Keith Parmenter wrote to Des the first of several letters linking him with Brinsmead's activities. Now, Keith came over to full council in 1978. The date was October 8 to 18. He did not phone or see Des. He said he was told that Des was in San Diego, so maybe he had a good reason. But he went back to Australia. He held a workers' meeting, either Sydney or Avondale, I don't know. And somebody called us. I can't remember who it is, but the timing meant it had to be a phone call. And he said Jack Castle, Parmenter had said that Jack Castle, the principal of PUC, had asked him to keep Des longer. Now, he hadn't told us this at this time, so this was news to us. So the next day, I turned up at Jack Castle's office, and it was around the end. I looked up a magazine and found out when the end of full council was, and the next day I heard that he was coming back, Jack Castle, went to his office, never did it before or after, sat and waited for him and asked him, said, I've heard that we're staying at PUC. And he said yes. As a matter of fact, Elder Parmenter asked if we would keep him here as it would help things settle down. So notice the fib to the Australian workers. In Parmenter's version, Jack Castle was asked to keep Des because they're very happy with him. But in Parmenter, Jack Castle has asked him to keep Des. And this must have been about the 19th or 20th of October in 1978. In early November, a letter written on the 28th of October from Parmenter came to Des. It was a pleasant letter, told Des all the rumours he'd heard about his teaching when he was in America, which you could imagine, about not enough sanctification and too much about justification and so on. And on the third page, just before signing off, he said, by the way, you'll be staying on at PUC. Now this is 2 and a bit weeks after he's notified the workers in Australia that Des is not going back, but he hasn't told us. And this is halfway through our stay. We've still got another year to go. And he adds, if you return to Australia, you won't be coming back to teach at Avondale. You will go out in the field as pastor. Now this broke the promise made to Des. And he wrote back the 3rd of November, a fairly straight but polite letter. Des is always polite. But he basically, I've got the letter around somewhere, but I'm not going to read it. He said to Parmenter, look, he said, Spangler and Eva have attended my meetings. Spangler said, you certainly can't be accused of not preaching on sanctification. He said, your sons were in my classes. They know what I teach. And you have listened to everything that people have said, and you haven't asked me whether it's true or not. And then he talked to him, I suppose, about the breaking of the promise. Des took that, Gilbert Valentine in his encyclopedia said Des was very upset. I never saw Des emotionally upset about politics, but he did have a sense of right and wrong. He felt it broke a promise. He told Duncan Eva, it was in our kitchen, and later talked to Parmenter, and then, of course, Eric Magnuson, we got the letter, that it was a condition of his going. Now, to go back as head of the Bible department, I actually don't think Des would have cared if they'd just made him a teacher. Being head of the department had a lot of administration. Des wanted to take people for a walk, not sit in committees. He was terrible at committees. But it was a promise. And that's the letter that Norman Young talks about in his interview, where he says Des went ballistic. And it sounds, when Norman talks, as though this happened in 1980. But the letters of Des to Parmenter are quite horrific. So I could never work out what Norman was going on about until he actually did this talk, and I realised he's talking about something that happened in 1978, almost 2 years before Glacier View. And it's all right for Norman to say, well, Des should just have accepted and gone out into the field. But Des knew what was happening. If he'd gone out into the field, Parmenter would have isolated him and he'd have been fired. But it was that letter that made Des feel that when the forum happened, he had nothing to lose. And he had nothing to lose by going to Glacier View because of what I told you. So a number of letters from Keith Parmenter to Des mentioning his supposed collusion with Bob Brinsmead. Des denies it. The source is never revealed during or ever since Glacier View. Des also wrote a letter after Glacier View and before firing saying, my wife and I have had no interaction with groups that are fighting Adventism. He made it very clear it wasn't true, but he still got fired. Now, near to the time of Glacier View, a boast was made by O.K. Anderson, accompanying an unknown man. A reliable witness gave them a lift. And O.K. Anderson said that the concerned brethren had Keith Parmenter, and the phrase they used was by the short and curlies, and would do as they wanted. And that is the first-hand account of something that people have said ever since Glacier View, because Keith Parmenter went to Glacier View in August 1980 and insisted that Des be dealt with that week. And this was told to us by Duncan Eva at Glacier View and reaffirmed in front of witnesses in 1983 in San Francisco when Eva and Spangler apologised to us for the way Glacier View was handled. Keith Parmenter wanted a decision by Friday, which later, and Bob Spangler later denied he said this, but there were witnesses. In the Friday evening meeting at Glacier View, Keith Parmenter gives Des two impossible possibilities he knows Des cannot agree to. One, not enough to put your views in your pocket, must say you are wrong and teach traditional Adventism. You must distance yourself from Bob Brinsmead in the review. I'll give you 2 weeks. Des said, I don't need 2 weeks. I could never agree to those two conditions if you gave me 1,000 years. Now, in that Friday meeting, Keith Parmenter discusses severance in detail, and at the end, Keith Parmenter says to me and Des after the meeting that he would offer Des a job in the SHF, but he knows it wouldn't suit him. I'd been crying all through the meeting. I wasn't there for the first hour. When I came out, I was there for the important part. When I came out, I was no longer crying. Fred Beltman asked me what happened. And I said they let Des go. I think that's what I said. Because that's what I thought had happened. And the news spread like a tsunami among the scholars. I think the next morning on the Sabbath, Keith Parmenter called me aside and told me off. He said, Prexad does not have the authority to fire Des. And they told the scholars that I was emotional and misrepresented the truth. And Neil Wilson told the scholars in the next set of meeting, the Sunday after Glacier View, and the following week, that they did not remove Des's credentials in the Friday afternoon meeting. It was an evasion, because it was apparent it was all over, and in 3 weeks Des was fired. Fred Veltman, Des's boss at PUC, wrote to PUC after this and said it's Des's fault. And within a week or two, he wrote a long letter, which I have, to Prexad saying, we the scholars were duped, among other things. And he wrote and apologised to Des. And there were about 55 letters sent defending Des to GC, but basically Neil Wilson said, we've done what we've done, and that was it. So I'm going to end there. That's the end of the two struts. And my next tape is going to be on how Neil Wilson did Des in. That's the main strut of my talk. So we talked about me and the CBs, Brinsmead, John Brinsmead and Parmenter. Now we're getting on to Neil Wilson. So it's a truncated form. I'm trying to show you the forces that got Des to Glacier View and then Neil Wilson's action. I know we're just about to start the main strut in the why. Not the why of Glacier View, but the how. So this is about how Neil Wilson did it. And it's going to be fairly focused on this. I seem to be able to talk a lot about a little. You need to read Cottrell's manuscript because he wrote shorthand notes. And when I think of Cottrell, I think of him with angel's wings and a white robe and white hair with a halo. And he's the recording angel, writing in shorthand. And I mean, what a blessing, what a providence to have somebody like Cottrell at Glacier View and also present in the church at the time. A great comfort to Des. They had their differences, as Larry Christoffel said on Daniel 9, but they were very close in thinking on these issues. And he was a wonderful support in many ways. We thought a great deal of Ray Cottrell. So I want to look at the short form of how Neil Wilson got rid of Des. And in my podcast, I'm not going to repeat it here, but I go through the evidence and the names of the people from GC who said that Des was going to be fired in the months before it happened. And so I hope you'll listen to those podcasts. They're probably different again. I hope they are. I've written a lot of information. All of the stuff I've written about Glacier View has got stuff on each video that's different to the one before. So it's worth, if you're really, really interested and you don't mind watching an old lady, I do have a unique viewpoint because of being with Des for all these years and actually being there. I wouldn't have got everything because we were barred from a lot of the meetings. But I was 35 at Glacier View. I know that because when we were in Washington, D.C., Luke went around telling everybody I was 35. He thought it was wonderful for some reason. So I'd have been one of the younger ones. Larry Geraghty, who can't remember anything about Glacier View, he told me when he visited not long ago, was a wonderful recorder. I'm going to refer to his history on Dallas Statement. And he's the only scholar, well, maybe Fred Veltman wrote, but Larry was the only one who wrote to Des with any sympathy after Glacier View. So he's been a good friend. Anyway, Neil Wilson fired Des using the Dallas Statement. And it says that in the Adventist Encyclopedia, and I'm very, very happy about that because that's what happened. And a great appearance was made of getting all these people together and getting consensus. But as Elaine pointed out, they didn't present the consensus publicly to Des. Now, as a lawyer, she brought this in, and I thought, oh, great, I can use that. He was never asked publicly what he thought of it. He told me he could live with it, and he told the people on Friday afternoon he could. And he must have told some of the scholars, because they've mentioned it here. Des said he could live, wasn't perfect, didn't expect it to be, but he said, I can live with a consensus statement. And that was not accepted. Anyway, first of all, I want to talk to you a little bit about how the Dallas Statement was put together, because I want to explain to you how it was used. And I always thought that the scholars a lot of them left early. They left on the Thursday. Heppenstall did. And there was talk, definite talk, at the end of Glacier View that we would go to the new gallery in England and Des would be an evangelist. They thought that this was an option. And I actually think that Wally Scragg came up with this. I won't tell you Wally's story, but I think you'd agree with me that he was probably the one who came up with the idea. And it was thought a good idea. Well, in Europe, these things aren't problems over there. We'll send him into England. And I remember Luke saying, don't want to go to London. So it was very much talked about. So the scholars got a surprise on the Friday, find out that Des had been fired because they thought that some of them knew that he thought the consensus was okay. And then it all broke down. And they really weren't in the Friday afternoon meeting, so they didn't know. But anyway, let's start at the Dallas Statement. Now, the Dallas Statement, Larry Geraghty's got a fine history, and anybody serious about Glacier View must read that article. I think it was published in June 1980. You can get it from Archives, the whole magazine. And you're looking for Larry Geraghty's history of the Dallas Statement. Now, it was worked on for 18 months. So it was worked on probably, when you think about it, well, it was before the forum meeting, so it wasn't planned to deal with Des, but I think they might have pushed it through to have it done so that it was done by the time they dealt with Des, because April 1980 was when it was put together on the floor as a statement, the 27 Fundamentals of Faith, at the Dallas General Conference in April 1980. So I hope I've made that clear. In time for Glacier View, which was held, 4 months later. But it had been worked on under the chairmanship of Duncan Eber for 18 months. And before that, we really didn't have a proper statement of belief. Uriah Smith's Fundamental Principles, after 1872, was put in various publications, and in 1931 the yearbook statement, which was largely for non-SDAs and was quite inadequate, and Larry explains what were the problems with that. The 22 fundamental beliefs that the committee reported were never officially discussed, approved, voted or formally adopted. So before 1980 we really didn't have a statement of fundamental beliefs. Now, about the time that Des did the forum meeting, that same month, Duncan Eber, they'd been working on it for over a year, I'd say around a year. He showed it to the GC officers, the division president, union presidents in North America, on the 10th of August 1979, so it's in the works. And then they met with 9 Andrews faculty, Thomas Blincoe, the Dean, Ivan Blazon, Ralph Dedrin, Lawrence Geraghty, Roy Graham, Bill Johnson, Hans Larendel, Gottfried Oosterweil, Bill Shea, and Richard Swartz, who wrote the biography of Kellogg. Now, Larry Geraghty's concerns in September 1979, when this committee was going, was that document as a whole was uneven in its organisation and style. It was a patchwork job, it had mixed terminology, a lack of balance with regard to length of individual sections, differences in the way the documentation was handled, general administrative concerns with events and behaviour rather than the meaning, e.g. the Lord's Supper is customarily observed once each quarter of the year. The educational system of the church is designed for partnership with the home for the salvation of the children, and so on. God's unchangeable law requires the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath from Sabbath Friday to sunset Saturday. So it's essentially the old fundamental statement in the yearbook was very superficial. So they added Fritz Guy and Kenneth Strand both on the seminary faculty, to the review committee, and the new committee of 12 divided up the paragraphs of the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs, and they essentially, within 6 days, came together to hammer out a consensus, paragraph by paragraph, on the document as a whole. And they were late into the night of September 18 in an attempt to be ready for the next day's meeting with the brethren from Washington, D.C. So when the leaders from Washington came, they were faced with the dilemma. Should they use the document they already had, or should they use this document prepared by the Andrews Committee? And they chose to take a look, and they really liked it. There's a lot of give and take. At one point, in trying to arrive at consensus wording for Creation Week, Hackett said, "Oh, well, you can word it any way you want. We'll have a crack at it back in Washington." So the Andrews group felt they were sort of wasting their time. The next week, they sent off their completed draft with the 27 paragraphs divided into 6 major sections, blah, blah, blah. To the extent the statement had literary form and beauty, the credit belonged to Fritz Guy, whose linguistic artistry and theological acumen were evident throughout. So they had a beautiful statement. And then Fred Veltman, their scholars had had 2 faculty meetings making recommendations, and most of those were added to the statement at Dallas. More changes were made at Dallas without consulting the Committee of 12 before Dallas. And at the first business session at Dallas, the delegates who'd been on this committee expressed shock. It was now substantially changed and virtually unrecognisable. It was disastrous in form, if not content. Gone was the balance, the beauty and the sensitivity, words, clumsy rhetoric, etc. So, huge changes at Dallas. Now, in this article, now I haven't put it in here, but when it was actually being worded on the floor, people like Russell Standish got up and put changes in, significant changes. And so when you look at it overall, it was a bit of a hash job. And it was pretty amazing. It came out as well as it did. Now, what did Neil Wilson say at Dallas? He said, in this statement that we're making, we're not suggesting changing. You've got to listen to this carefully, because it tells you his determination before Glacier View. We are not suggesting changing any belief or doctrine that this church has held. We have no interest in tearing up any of the foundations of historical Adventism. This document is not designed to do it, nor to open the way so it can be done. And it should be clear, we're not adding anything, nor are we deleting anything in terms of historical Adventist theology. We're just trying to express our beliefs in a way that will be understood today. So he basically said it was a matter of rewording, cultural change, modern terminology. It wasn't being changed. And he said, though he hoped to vote the document in Dallas, he was in no rush. The church was not adrift. We've got a clear statement of fundamental belief. We'll hold it to it until we decide to refine, reword and restate it in today's language. And to those who were afraid of a creed, Wilson said, the Seventh-day Church, Adventist Church, does not have a creed as such. Nothing is set in concrete in terms of human words. The time never comes when any human document cannot be improved on. And he was reassuring people at Dallas and saying, don't worry, nothing's going to change. Now, in the first meeting at Glacier View, Cottrell has written a little bit about this. My memory is harsher than his, and those who go in to do history, you will actually hear the talk of Neil Wilson again. Need to check what I say by what was actually said. I saw the meeting, well, afterwards Des and I looked at each other and said, well, he's told us. We thought it was pretty clear what was going to happen. He said they'd come up with a statement of belief at Dallas, We've got no intention of changing this week. The scholars have immunity here. They can say what they like, but a vote is going to be taken at the end of the week. It cannot be half and half. It's all got to be one way. And after the meeting, Des and I said, well, that tells us how it's going to go. There's a lot I don't remember about Glacier View. I don't remember the room we stayed in. I don't remember having a meal there. I don't remember the whereabouts of Luke most of the time, but he was in safe hands with the Holoviacs, with Kendra and Brendan Holoviac. He told Bill Shea, who said, "Who are you?" He said, "I am the son of the heretic." He was in the Tuesday meeting when Neil Wilson jumped quite harshly on Des. I do have a memory of going for a walk on my own, and I saved a chipmunk that was being mauled by the camp cat. I took the chipmunk off him. I could have been scratched to death by the cat, and I carried him in my hand down the road. And suddenly he came to life. He raced up my shoulder, down to the ground and off. Hooray! He lived to face another day. And then I found out that they carry rabies. But that's one memory I have. But I remember what I remember pretty clearly. And when I go back to my original, I usually work on it, I go back, it's very much the same as it was back then. Now, Des was accused of not being social by the other scholars, but he had a miserable time at Glacier View. He was taken walks by many to tell him his fortune and tell him how to behave. He almost had no sleep, so it was no sinecure for Des to be there. It's all right for the others, it was a bit of a holiday. And Erwin Gain and Maury Venden, who I've mentioned in other tapes, who were both very negative towards Des. They both apologised when they saw he was for the tip. So the outline of the week, there was that early meeting with Neil Wilson that I've mentioned, and then day 1, 2, 3 and 4, Monday to Thursday, there were small meetings in the mornings with the small committees who studied specific questions. You've got to remember Des's book, according to Cottrell, very few people read it. Some of the scholars would have read it. No, Parminder didn't read it. Athol Tolhurst didn't read it. The Northern California Conference president, Phil Follett, didn't read it. He said, "Why should I read it when I know it's wrong?" It was not opened in small groups or in the main meetings. And Des was not supposed to speak. So it really wasn't about Des's manuscript at all. All the leaders of the groups, these small groups, were conservative, and so were some of the secretaries and so on. In the afternoon, the group leaders of these small groups wrote up an outline of what had been decided and the vote in the morning meetings. And in the afternoon, every afternoon, they had a full assembly where everybody was there. Des and I were there, and the group leaders reported what they'd come up with in the morning study. And Cottrell describes this in detail in Spectrum, particularly the one that he was in. In the early days at Glacier View, there was a lot of hope because Neil Wilson had gone down to Loma Linda, and when asked by the scholars, was Des going to be on trial, he said no. His ideas will be on trial, but he won't. But that meant he would be on trial. But they came thinking he was all right, and that sort of threw them off, I think. People were lovely to us. It was a beautiful spirit there, very Christian, except for Neil Wilson on Tuesday night with Des, where Edward Heppenstall had asked a question about Daniel 7, hoping that Des could see the judgment, investigative judgment in it. And Des had already, in my memory, he'd already answered this question with Heppenstall on the Sunday outside Heppenstall's quarters, and told him that he couldn't see it. And then he asked him again in front of everybody. And Des said to me he didn't want to embarrass Heppenstall, and so he went on a boundary ride, and he didn't look good, but he didn't want to embarrass his professor. And you'll notice that Richard Coffin said that his students knew what Heppenstall thought. They thought he would support Des, and when he didn't, they were dumbfounded. They didn't know what to think. Anyway, Neil Wilson jumped in and reprimanded Des and said, "You never listen to everybody. He's our emeritus professor, highly regarded, and you won't listen to him," and so on. And Des picked up his papers, walked off. It was very dramatic. James Cox wept. Herb Douglas didn't sleep all night. It was a very dramatic moment. And I asked Des years later, "Were you sorry that you walked off?" Des never got in a huff. I never saw it. But I think he just moves fast. But he said to me, Neil Wilson was reprimanding him like a teenager in front of everybody, and he was doing it for political advantage. And Des saw what he was doing, and most people looked at that and were watching Des, but they didn't watch what Wilson was doing. I'll get down to which statement was which, because people get mixed up. The Dallas statement was done at Dallas before Glacier View, and number 23 was the one about the sanctuary. So Glacier View was about number 23 of the Dallas statement, 27 fundamentals. So we can forget about the Dallas statement now. We've already talked about it. So on Tuesday, Norman thinks it was Tuesday. It's not absolutely sure. Neil Wilson at least asked him, he probably asked the others, he asked 6 people to participate in making the 10-point statement. And I'll come to that. Norm Young was one of them. And he asked James Cox, "Do you think I ought to do it?" And James Cox didn't give him a good answer, so he asked Des, and Des said, "Well, better you than anybody else." So this wasn't a problem to us that Norman helped to write this document. He didn't know how it was going to be used. And if you want to read the history of the 10-point statement, the best thing you can read is Norman's article in Adventist Today, 2006, "A Reluctant Participate, blah, blah, blah." Very good article. So this group I'll come back to that statement. Anyway, Thursday was a difficult day. In the afternoon of the full session, Elder Pearson had a letter, and he was not there because he had heart trouble. Harry Lowe, who had been the head of the Daniel Committee in the late 50s and 60s, also couldn't be there because of the height. I think it was about 8,000 feet up, I'm not sure. And so they had heart trouble. And I think Tom Blinko was there and had to leave because he had some sort of heart event at Glacier View. Anyway, Harry Lowe's letter, where he said that Des had brought out nothing new that they hadn't dealt with in the 1960s, was not read, but Pearson's was, and it was a long thing, and it had a lot of Russell Standish's ideas. So he was saying, I won't get it exactly right, but Des didn't believe in the new birth, he didn't believe in sanctification, he didn't believe in the Holy Spirit, he didn't believe in the sinful nature of Christ. Anyway, it was a horrible letter, very inaccurate. And but there were resounding amens going around the room. And that sort of fits in with what Richard Coffin said, that when he was talking to people, it was a done deed. Most of the leaders were traditional, and that they went there to see Des gotten rid of. Anyway, many left Thursday night, but I'd been talking to an African man. I thought he came from Kenya, but I might be wrong. But he was young, highly intelligent. I'd been talking to him all week, quite progressive, and he'd been very hopeful. He came to me and he said, "There's no hope." Heppenstall also left, and I was nearby when he left, and he was upset with Des. I'll probably talk a little bit about Heppenstall. I can't fully understand him, but I can tell you what I know. I believe he said Des was mad, but he left unhappy with Des. However, when he found out that they'd fired Des, he was furious. Wrote us a letter, he was furious. And we stayed friends with the Heppenstalls. So anyway, now to the different statements. So I've told you about the little groups. They get together their statements, read it out, and then probably on the Thursday night, or maybe it was ongoing, Bill Johnson and Fritz Guy, and I've asked Fritz Guy about this. He said that in the actual writing, it was him and Bill Johnson, and he said that Bill didn't just dictate it, that he said wherever he was, there'd always be back and forth. He typed it, but he participated in it. He doesn't remember Gerhard Hasel being around. Well, he may have written that on his own, the Ellen White statement. Now, it's in two parts, and it's in the ministry, pages 16 to 19, and it's the consensus statement, sometimes called plural, but the first part is the Christ in the Heavenly Sanctuary, the second part is Ellen White, etc. So you can go back and read those. Now, these I've told you about who wrote them. So I mentioned those 7 small study groups. If you want the statistics in the ministry, and I'll mention this properly somewhere, there's a particular 2 pages where it tells you all the committees and who was there and so on. So very useful for that. Now, Des wasn't part of these small committees, so he had no input into the consensus statement. The 10-point statement, which I've told you was put together by 6 people, including Norm Young, and I do know the others. Spangler was there, sort of as coordinator. Herb Douglas was on it. I think Larendell was on it. But anyway, I'd have to go back and check because, I get mixed up. Getting old. This 10-point statement is on page 20 to 22 in the October 1980 Ministry magazine. And it's called, not the 10-point statement, but the Statement on Desmond Ford document. It's no wonder it's confusing. There's several statements when you add the Dallas statement, and I noticed that Peter was always getting them mixed up. But the 2 essential ones were the consensus statement, which was the consensus on what the scholars mainly believed about the sanctuary, Bible View, and Ellen White, and then the 10-point statement, which was showing 10 points where Des differed in his manuscript from the Dallas statement. So they're comparing him with number 23 on the sanctuary and saying where he's different. So keep that in mind. It was sort of ex cathedra Glacier View. It wasn't part of the official meetings. Most people there weren't aware of this writing of the statement. And it was, as I said, 10 points where Des differed from the Dallas statement, which in Neil Wilson's mind was the traditional view that we'd always taught. Now, we go to the Friday morning. The Friday morning was a full assembly, and in the first part we were there. And they read out the consensus statements on Ellen White and the Bible and Ellen White. Now, they were duplicated, they were handed out, everyone had a copy and read along, and it was read from the front. And as it was read, people put their hand up. They could make a small change, which would go in the final copy. And then at the end, it was voted on. Nobody's ever seen the vote. Milton went looking for it, and they did something with the vote, he thinks. Des was sitting on it and read it and turned to me excitedly and said, "This is great, I can live with this." Now, it still mentioned 1844 and the investigative judgment, but it made about 12 key changes, and they'll be with my documents, and I'm sure that Peter will be making them available as well. So then we were asked to leave, and you might ask, why? Why did we need to leave? Now, the reason that reason that Wilson gave was we want to get it ready, and then we want to show it to Des and see what he thinks of it. So that's why we were asked to leave. It was read from the front, because now you read Cottrell and he tells you what happened. We weren't there. It was read from the front. People didn't have a copy in their hands, so they couldn't take it away with them. They were very clever. Lou Venden said he didn't agree with it all. And Fritz Guy said, I hope this is not going to be used to discipline anyone. And Wilson said, no, it will not. And in fact, it was used to discipline Des. And it was used to fire the many ministers who left after Glacier View over theology. So we come in the afternoon, the last day, well, it wasn't the last day, Saturday they had a meeting, a sermon preached by Duncan Eva on, I think it was consolation. We were almost the only people not crying. I'd stopped crying by then. And I remember that B. Neal, who was one of the few ladies there, she was a theologian, she came up to Des and said, have you got a heart of steel? Anyway, the tears were over for me. But in the Friday afternoon, I was absent for the first hour. I actually went there and I was crying so hard that I left. And then I thought, after about an hour, I must go and support Des. I was still crying. So I was there, I think, for the most important parts. And also I have the notes, the handwritten and typed notes of Bob Spangler of the afternoon and some other people who were there. These were used to compile the ministry articles. Des said what's missing in those notes and in the ministry is that all the questions they asked, he answered. And of course, these notes are written from their perspective, making a case, but in doing so, they reveal a lot about Des. In the notes, he says, I'm sorry for all the trouble I've caused. I'll write in the review and tell people not to leave. And they're using it to show that Des acknowledged that they were right. But the real thing is that it showed how Des behaved in that meeting. As Neil Wilson said, he was a real Christian gentleman. When they were going to read the 10-point statement, Des said, give it to me. I can read it in 5 minutes. Because I think it was on a sheet of paper. And by the time it was in the ministry, it was about 3 pages long. Because they'd added a lot. Now, I can save you time if you let me read it. He disagreed with the accusations about his scholarship, which were point 2. And I asked him about that before he died, and he said there were some problems that the typists had made. And I actually, when I redid the Glacier View manuscript, I found a huge mistake by accident when I was putting in the Hebrew, where somebody had put in, where whoever was putting it together had pasted it in, and she had put one page down and then gone backwards and put the page before next, got them out of order. And it was so technical, this part, that you wouldn't know it was wrong. But I happened to be putting a Hebrew word down the bottom of this page, and so I followed up, and it didn't make sense. So I fixed that one. But that was the sort of thing that happened. You've got to remember, it was done, Des went there in December. He would have had to do all the research and write. It was like a PhD. And all the secretaries would have been at Dallas. So they had all that time out. And I know they had a great scramble to have it done. So, you know, Des is not a poor scholar. It's like them saying he's arrogant. Just rubbish. He's been given accolades by the people he studied with, like F.F. Bruce, and the man who, can't think of his name for the moment, who he did his PhD with. I mean, you know, he spoke from knowledge, and they want to say, I think so, but anyway, we won't go into that, doesn't matter. Anyway, Des read this statement. He read it in 5 minutes, and he said, apart from one or two details, he said it's a fair statement of where I differ with the traditional view. And Neil Wilson said, thank you. You've made our job easy. Someone, possibly Francis Wernick, who was one of the vice presidents, said, what did you think of the consensus statement? It was sort of a throwaway line, the summation of the small groups. And Des said it was great. It went towards my position on about 12 points, 7 of them key. The church has moved towards my manuscript. In a few years, they'll accept it all. Maybe that was a bit arrogant. This caused quite a shock. The people there assembled clearly thought the consensus statement agreed with the 10-point statement. And Francis Wernick made the line of the century, if I thought it had gone towards your view, I wouldn't have voted for it. Wilson asked Des at the lift at the end of the meetings for a list of those points where he thought that the consensus statement agreed with him, and Des typed it out and gave it to him. So think again what a lens point was, that if they really wanted a consensus, they would have asked Des in public, what do you think of the consensus statement? And they never did. Today, I'm trying to get Fritz Guy to do an interview. And he's 90, and he's a bit reluctant, but John Butler is trying to talk him into it. And I asked him to ask Fritz how much he participated in the consensus statement, because when you listen to Bill Johnson, and I know that he worked for hours on it because he told Ellen, and he probably had the fair share. He said he dictated it because he did longhand, and Fritz typed it. So I asked him how much he put into it in case he won't do the interview. And this is what he said. He takes issue with the suggestion that Bill Johnson dictated the statement and that he, Fritz, was the stenographer or a typist. He said, anyone who knows me knows that couldn't be true. And he says drafting the consensus statement was a fully collaborative process. He doesn't remember Gerhard Hasel playing any role at all in drafting the statement, so he must have done his work elsewhere, including Ellen White's contribution to the sanctuary doctrine. In his account, the consensus statement was a 2-man effort by Bill and Fritz. So, there you are. And here's another statement from Fritz in the same email. One other significant memory on the statement, which I've heard Fritz mention on several occasions, this is John Butler, is as follows. After Bill and Fritz had drafted the statement, Willis Hackett came to Fritz personally and complained about the statement because even Des Ford could sign it. If you can't see the funny side of that, I can't help you. For Fritz, that's exactly what a consensus statement means. It defines what all the principals agree on. Fritz believed the Hackett comment laid bare the intentions of church leadership at Glacier View. They were out to get Des, make him the odd man out. This was not a symposium for discussing the strengths and weaknesses of the sanctuary doctrine. This was an inquisition to vilify Des. Well, you heard it here. You know, before these interviews, I thought I was the only person who knew all this. But I find out that it's quite well known and that I can lie down and die happily because I'm just concerned to defend Des as much as I can while I'm still alive. And anyway, so in this Friday afternoon meeting, apart from reading out the 10-point statement, they made a number of accusations. They had a whole list of accusations against Des. They said he acted like a real Christian, and they were pleased that he responded so well to the 10-point statement and made their job easily. But they definitely thought that he had great character defects, and here's some of the things that they said. Now, I didn't hear this, but it came up in an interview with Adrian Zukowski in the Spectrum, October, well, it could be November, one of the two, October 1980, Cottrell's article. They said Des leaked the manuscript. And actually, Dean Jennings got it off Elder Figure's wife. Remember, Elder Figure was the General Conference president in the time of Andreasen and Questions on Doctrine. And he was Dean Jennings' patient. And he borrowed it through the wife. And I think he sent it to Bob Parr. Des denied leaking it. But I've actually got a letter from Florida. We went down there, a friend put us in a hotel, either for a week, but I think it was for a month, for Des to get ready to go to Glacier View. And I wrote a letter to Calvin. And in that, they were working in Florida because the guy who put us up in Florida also published the Glacier View manuscript, Doug Moorhead. And he had it in his hands. And I presume that Des had given it to him. But it wouldn't have gone anywhere else than that. They were typing it out. And I was helping them in some way. So, but sending it out to other people, and Des did have the legal right because he checked on it. GC didn't, because they put all the work into it and his wages were paid by the church. They didn't want him to publish it, but the lawyers said to him, no, he's the author, he has the right. So one was leaking the manuscript, and I'm sure some of the traditional people would have leaked the manuscript, but Des, apart from what I've told you, he didn't do it. Bob Brinsmead was another issue. Neil Wilson said Des colluded with Bob to send out 50,000 cassettes. I told you about that. But those, it took me 27 years, but found out that was completely fictional. Then there was Parmenter's 4-point letters, and I've told you 4 conditions in the letter that Des had to agree to stay in the work. And this letter was very harsh. A copy in the ministry, we never had it in our hands. The one in the ministry was a lot softer. And I've told you the 2 things. It's not enough to shelve your views. You've got to change your ideas and teach traditional Adventism and say you were wrong. Well, Des couldn't do that, and nor could many of the scholars there. 2, you must write against Brinsmead in the Review and Herald. And he was preaching the gospel. Des said he would not write against the fellow minister. And then Parmenter said he'd give him 2 weeks, and Des said you could give me 100 or 1,000 years, I couldn't do it. And it's interesting to watch. These men could not understand why Des would not come out against Brinsmead. I presume because they were more political and they would have done it to save their job, but Des wouldn't do it. And after that, I think I've told you this, that Parmenter talked to us about severance. He talked to Lance Butler. We get some month's wages and our fare home. He came up afterwards with a small smile and said, I'd offer you a job in the SHF. I know it wouldn't suit you. Small brain Jill thought that they'd fired Des, or at least let him go. And when Fred Beltman asked her, she said, they let Des go. A tsunami went around Glacier View. Parmenter called me aside, told me off for misrepresenting what had happened. So I've worked on these slides twice, and I've already told you the story. So I've told you about there was at least one meeting in Washington that Des attended and I didn't, where they topped up the meeting with Ken Woods, Herbert Douglas, Arthur White, and said that Des couldn't go to the new gallery because he was too much of a heretic, so that was scotched. I think there was only one, but there might have been 2 meetings, and then 3 weeks after Glacier View, there was an Executive Division Committee meeting in Sydney, and soon this will be available online as a podcast. Now, I haven't heard it, but I have friends who have the tape, and they're getting it duplicated, and you'll be able to get your own copy. And Neil Wilson sent a tape telling the people on that committee that they must fire Des. 4 of them refused. And I think that John Carter mentioned who they were. It was him, I think Ray Swanell, and I must tell his brother, I think he'll be quite tickled pink because his brother's quite traditional, and Eric Magnuson, and who was the other one? So the other thing that you need to look at is the October 1980 Ministry magazine, the introduction on page 3, which I think was not written by Elder Spangler because it speaks about him in the third person. I believe it's by Neil Wilson. And in the introduction, called Why the Special Issue, it states in the third paragraph, "Let it be clearly understood that what we've printed in the question and answer section in this journal is not to be taken as the official view of the Church on the sanctuary doctrine. We have only one official view, the statement of fundamental beliefs voted at our April 1980 General Conference session. Even Christ in the Heavenly Sanctuary, which is the consensus statement, adopted at the Glacier View meeting, is not the official view of the Church, other than that portion taken from our fundamental beliefs." So if you want to go and read that, you have to get the Ministry magazine downloaded from the archive and just read it several times and you'll see what it's saying. The consensus statement wasn't our fundamental beliefs, only the Dallas statement. So here's a summary of how Neil Wilson handled Glacier View. He used the Dallas statement of 27 fundamentals, number 23, it's now 24, on the sanctuary as the benchmark for Glacier View at his first meeting. We are not changing from this week. Unbeknownst to Neil Wilson, the sanctuary statement, number 23, had changed from traditional Adventism. The Andrews scholars had worked on it in October 79. Their changes remained in the final version when it went from 2 apartments, walking from one apartment to another, to 2 different phases of ministry, which was Heppenstall's contribution, I believe. And that's what's in the Dallas statement. So it's not, in that sense, that part is not traditional Adventism, but Neil Wilson didn't notice it. Just try to tell him. Didn't work. The initiation of the 10-point statement was done behind the back of the participants from Tuesday, probably, at Glacier View. So Neil Wilson goes to individuals and asks them will they participate. Norman feels like this, and now looking back wishes he hadn't done it. But, we never felt badly about that at all. He didn't know how it was going to be used. The voting of the consensus statement. The consensus statement was voted by the whole group, and the 10-point statement was not voted on. They said it would not be used to discipline that afternoon. That's what they did. Because the consensus statement really wasn't brought out to Des. It was just an offhand statement saying, what do you think of it? And when he said, it's gone towards my position in 12 points, they were quite stunned. And my memory of that time, of sitting at the front, facing all these men, well, there were tables around like that. And I think Des must have been here and I was here. And watching these men, I thought they're just like the disciples. Jesus is talking to them. I'm not saying Des is Jesus, but the same principle. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know the difference between the consensus statement and the 12-point statement. They thought they were the same. The statement in the ministry that I've just read, affirming all of the above, the Dallas statement was our statement of faith. So Des was judged by traditional Adventism, not by the consensus of the group, and certainly not by his manuscript. They didn't deal with his ideas. Neil Wilson said at Dallas that the statement of fundamental beliefs was not a creed, but at Glacier View he used it as a creed to fire Des. Now that's where my slides have ended, but afterwards for 10 years the DARCOM committee met, and you remember what Neil Andreessen said about it. They did decide to soften the idea of the investigative judgment. It was too harsh. So they made it full of assurance and good news. But they didn't really change the idea that God was going to be vindicated by his people. Otherwise, Darcom was largely a defence of the traditional views. That's what Roy Ingram says. Only 2 or 3% of Darcom actually dealt with the issues that Des raised. That's what Neil Zerek said. Most of it was a defence. And Des has written on it too, saying the same things. And a lot of things people said, probably, perhaps, there's no... Anyway, I think on this part of it, I've shown you through my history and the CBs, Bob Brinsmead, John Brinsmead, Parmenter. So Parmenter, urged by the CBs, pushes Des towards America, but Wilson is the executioner. Probably for good reasons. It's pretty amazing because there was Davenport, Harris Pine Mills, Walter Ray, and Des that he had to deal with. And, he managed it. But you couldn't trust. Like Lynn Bartlett says to me that he lived next door to Neil Wilson, and I presume it was in the 90s. I must check with Lynn. And he would talk to Elder Wilson as his neighbour and, talk about Des. And Neil Wilson would say, oh, if we'd had our time again, we might have done things differently. But I'm saying to you, you can't believe Neil Wilson. He learnt this is what Des said, he learnt his skills as a diplomat in Egypt. And I look back, and Neil Wilson, he was true to himself, but he knew what he was doing, he planned it ahead. He did it, he said he was doing it, and at the end he said he'd done it. And there you are. Thank you.